Have you ever wondered what happens when the only person willing to tell the truth is punished instead of protected? What if the nurse everyone ignored was actually the one person standing between life and death? The winter wind pushed icy snow against the tall windows of North Valley Medical Center. It was still dark outside, and the city lights looked blurry through the falling snow. Most people were asleep, but inside the intensive care unit, every second could mean the difference between life and death. The hospital looked peaceful. Machines beeped softly. Ventilators breathed with perfect rhythm. Monitors showed stable numbers. Everything appeared normal. But one nurse never trusted appearances. Her name was Hannah Brooks. She had worked the night shift for almost 13 years. She was never the loudest person in the room. She never searched for attention. She never argued unless a patient's life depended on it. Most people believed experience meant knowing all the answers. Hannah believed something different. She believed survival depended on asking the right questions. That simple habit made her different from everyone else. While other nurses looked at the monitors first, Hannah always looked at the patient. She watched breathing. She watched tiny movements. She watched worried family members. I always count. You think something's wrong? I don't know yet. Olivia looked through the glass. The patient's wife sat quietly beside the bed. She wasn't crying. She wasn't talking. She had simply stopped tapping her foot. Most people would never notice something like that. Hannah did. She stepped inside. She greeted the wife with a warm smile before moving toward the patient. Everything still looked normal. She checked his skin. Slightly cooler. She checked his hands. A little paler than before. She gently called his name. The man opened his eyes. He answered correctly, but his voice sounded slower than 30 minutes earlier. Very small differences. Almost impossible to notice. Almost. Hannah looked toward the drainage tube connected after surgery. The amount of blood wasn't increasing. That should have been good news. Instead, it worried her. Blood had stopped flowing too suddenly. Sometimes no movement was more dangerous than too much movement. She leaned closer. A tiny clot was forming inside the tube. Almost invisible. She immediately called the surgical fellow. After several rings, a sleepy voice answered. The numbers are stable, the doctor said before she even finished explaining. The numbers are, Hannah replied calmly. The drainage isn't. Silence. You think he's bleeding? I think the tube is blocked. Those are different things. They become the same thing if we wait too long. The doctor sighed but agreed to come. 6 minutes later he arrived looking tired and slightly annoyed. He examined the tube. Then his expression changed. You were right. He quickly removed the blockage. Dark blood suddenly rushed through the drainage line. Seconds later the patient's blood pressure began dropping. The blocked tube had been hiding dangerous internal bleeding. Within moments, alarms filled the room. Doctors rushed inside. Blood products were ordered. The patient was taken back into surgery before pressure around his heart became deadly. His life was saved. Not because a machine warned everyone. Because one nurse noticed something that didn't fit. The next morning, Olivia found Hannah washing her hands. How did you know? Hannah looked at the running water for a moment. I didn't. Olivia frowned. You just saved his life. I noticed one thing that didn't belong. You always do. Hannah smiled softly. I just keep looking after everyone else stops. That answer sounded simple. Too simple. But it explained everything. Most people search for proof that everything was fine. Hannah searched for the one detail that suggested something wasn't. That difference had saved countless lives. It had also made powerful people inside the hospital uncomfortable. Because Hannah didn't care about titles. She cared about patients. And very soon, that would make her the hospital's biggest problem. Morning sunlight slowly pushed away the darkness outside the hospital. But inside North Valley Medical Center, another kind of storm was beginning. The patient Hannah had helped save was recovering after emergency surgery. Doctors praised the fast response. The official report thanked the surgical team. No one mentioned the nurse who had noticed the tiny warning signs before anyone else. That didn't surprise Hannah. She had never worked for recognition. She worked so people could go home alive. Later that afternoon, while updating patient records, She noticed another emergency arriving through the emergency department. A 58-year-old school principal named Margaret Collins had come to the hospital complaining of chest pressure, dizziness, and unusual pain traveling down her left arm. The emergency physician completed the first examination. Blood tests looked normal. The first heart tracing didn't appear dangerous. After speaking with Margaret for several minutes, the senior cardiologist, Dr. Victor Hayes, believed anxiety was causing her symptoms. "She's under stress," he said confidently. "Give her fluids, let her rest, then discharge her." The paperwork was already being prepared. Hannah wasn't assigned to Margaret's case. She happened to pass by while helping another patient. As she walked past the room, she noticed Margaret gently rubbing her left wrist. She stopped. "Does your wrist hurt?" Hannah asked. Margaret looked surprised. "A little." "Did it start before or after the chest pressure?" "Before. Then the pressure spread." Hannah nodded slowly. She quietly opened Margaret's chart. Family history. Her father had died from sudden heart failure before turning 60. Her older sister had received an implanted heart device years earlier. Those details immediately caught Hannah's attention. She compared today's heart tracing with one taken several months earlier. The difference was tiny. So tiny that most people would ignore it. But Hannah didn't. She walked toward Dr. Hayes. "Doctor, may I show you something?" Without looking up from his computer, he answered, "I'm busy." "It will only take a moment." He sighed before turning around. "What is it?" Hannah placed both heart tracings side by side. The pattern changed. Dr. Hayes barely looked. Minor variation. Combined with her family history and symptoms. Still anxiety. "I think we should repeat the tests." The doctor's expression hardened. "You think? I believe it's safer." He folded his arms. "Are you practicing cardiology now?" "No." "Then let cardiology do its job." "I only want another evaluation." "I've already made my decision." Several nurses quietly watched the conversation. Nobody spoke. Everyone respected Dr. Hayes. He was famous, successful, highly respected. Patients specifically requested him. Questioning him almost never ended well. But Hannah wasn't trying to embarrass him. She only wanted one more test. "If I'm wrong," Hannah said calmly, "we lose less than an hour." Dr. Hayes stared at her. "And if I'm right," Hannah answered softly, "we lose part of her heart." Silence filled the hallway. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Dr. Hayes picked up the discharge papers. "She's going home." Margaret left the hospital that night believing everything was fine. Hannah watched her walk toward the exit. Something didn't feel right. She couldn't explain it. She simply hoped she was wrong. 38 hours later, an ambulance raced toward North Valley Medical Center. Paramedics rushed inside pushing a stretcher. The patient was Margaret. This time she was barely conscious. Her blood pressure was dangerously low. She was sweating heavily. A second heart tracing immediately showed what Hannah had feared from the beginning. A serious heart attack. Doctors activated the cardiac emergency team within seconds. Because Hannah had documented her earlier concerns in the patient's record, the emergency team immediately understood what had changed. Margaret was rushed straight into surgery. Hours later, she survived. Barely. The hospital celebrated another successful emergency response. But once again, nobody mentioned the nurse who had tried to stop the disaster before it happened. Instead, a week later, Hannah received an email from Human Resources. Mandatory meeting. Conference room 3. Attendance required. She already knew what it was about. Inside the room sat Human Resources Director Karen Foster. A folder rested on the table. Karen offered a polite smile. "This isn't punishment." Hannah looked at the folder. "It says corrective action." "It's simply documentation." "It says I created conflict." Karen nodded carefully. "The concern is your communication style." "My communication saved a patient." "The investigation couldn't confirm that." "The second heart attack confirmed it." Karen remained silent. "The hospital has a reporting structure," she finally said. "When senior physicians make decisions, Staff members are expected to respect those decisions. Hannah looked directly at her. The reporting structure sent Margaret home. Karen slowly slid a pen across the table. Please sign acknowledging you've received this notice. Hannah quietly signed her name. Then, beneath her signature, she added one short sentence. Patient safety concerns remain unresolved. Karen looked down at the page. You didn't need to write that. Hannah closed the folder. I already did. She stood up, picked up her copy, and calmly walked out. She had no idea. That single sentence would eventually become the reason powerful people inside the hospital decided she had to disappear. The warning in Hannah's personnel file should have frightened her. Instead, it reminded her why she became a nurse in the first place. She didn't choose medicine because it was easy. She chose it because every patient deserved someone willing to speak when everyone else stayed silent. For several weeks, life inside North Valley Medical Center seemed normal again. The hospital remained busy. Doctors performed successful surgeries. Patients recovered. Families celebrated happy endings. But behind the smiling faces, another dangerous problem was quietly growing. One evening, a 63-year-old construction supervisor named Daniel Rivera was admitted after major abdominal surgery. At the beginning of Hannah's shift, Daniel was joking with the nurses. He laughed about the hospital food. He promised his wife he would be home before the weekend. Everything seemed encouraging. Hours later, something changed. Not dramatically. Not enough to trigger alarms. Just enough for Hannah to notice. Daniel suddenly became quieter. His breathing became slightly faster. His hands felt colder. When Hannah asked him today's date, he answered correctly. But it took him much longer than before. His temperature had risen only a little. Blood pressure still looked acceptable. His laboratory results remained inside normal limits. The monitor continued showing reassuring numbers. Everyone else believed he was simply tired. Hannah wasn't convinced. She immediately called the surgical resident. The young doctor arrived a few minutes later carrying a tablet. He quickly reviewed Daniel's chart. Everything looks stable. Hannah shook her head. He isn't. The monitor says otherwise. The monitor is behind. The resident frowned. What does that mean? It means his body is changing before the numbers do. The resident looked at Daniel again. I think you're overreacting. I think he's developing a serious infection. He doesn't meet the protocol. He will. The resident sighed impatiently. We'll repeat blood work in the morning. He may not have until morning. The doctor closed the tablet. You need to focus on nursing responsibilities. Hannah answered calmly. I am. Without another word, the resident walked away. Most nurses would have accepted the decision. Most nurses would have documented the conversation and continued working. Hannah couldn't. She picked up the phone again. This time she called Dr. Michael Turner, the overnight critical care physician. When Michael answered, Hannah explained every small detail she had observed. Unlike the resident. He listened. I'll be there in 5 minutes. When he arrived, he examined Daniel himself. He reviewed Hannah's observations instead of ignoring them. Then his expression changed. Again. She quietly entered the same conference room. Karen Foster sat waiting. Another folder rested on the table. This concerns your recent conduct. Hannah slowly opened the file. Corrective action number 2. Reason. Failure to follow proper reporting procedures. She looked up. I reported a medical emergency. Karen folded her hands. You bypassed the assigned physician. He refused to examine the patient. The resident was following hospital policy. The patient wasn't following policy. Karen remained silent. Hannah. The critical care doctor agreed with me. He wasn't assigned to that case. He saved Daniel's life. Karen sighed deeply. The issue isn't whether the patient survived. Hannah stared at her. Then what is the issue? The issue is teamwork. Hannah almost smiled. So teamwork means staying quiet? It means respecting the chain of command. The chain of command almost buried Daniel. Neither woman spoke for several seconds. Finally, Karen slid another pen across the table. Please sign. Once again. Hannah signed her name. And once again. She added another sentence beneath it. Patient safety must always come before hierarchy. Karen looked disappointed. You keep making this harder. Hannah quietly closed the folder. No. The hospital does. She walked out without another word. By now, people inside North Valley Medical Center had started noticing a pattern. Every time Hannah questioned a dangerous decision, someone's life was saved. Every time a life was saved, administration wrote another warning. Doctors whispered about her in hallways. Managers called her difficult. Some nurses admired her courage. Others became afraid to stand beside her. Nobody wanted to become the next target. One night during break, Olivia sat beside Hannah in the staff lounge. You know they're building a case against you. I know. Doesn't it scare you? Hannah stirred her coffee. Of course. Then why keep fighting? She looked through the window toward the ICU. Because somewhere behind one of those doors, someone is depending on me to notice what everyone else misses. If I stop paying attention because I'm afraid, then the wrong person pays the price. Olivia looked down at her untouched coffee. She finally understood. Hannah wasn't risking her career because she enjoyed conflict. She was risking everything because she believed silence could kill. And upstairs, inside the executive offices, hospital leaders had already started discussing one question. How could they get rid of the nurse who kept exposing problems before anyone else noticed them? The executive conference room was silent. Outside the large glass windows, snow continued falling over the city. Inside, 3 senior leaders sat around a polished wooden table. Hospital CEO Richard Bennett leaned back in his chair, while reading Hannah Brooks' employee file. He slowly closed the folder. This can't continue. Across from him, Human Resources Director Karen Foster remained quiet. Chief of Cardiology Dr. Victor Hayes folded his arms. I warned you months ago, he said. She refuses to stay in her place. Richard tapped the folder with one finger. She's becoming a liability. Karen carefully chose her words. Her clinical record is exceptional. Dr. Hayes gave a cold smile. Her medical skills aren't the issue. What is? She questions authority. Karen looked at the disciplinary reports. Every case listed here ended with the patient surviving. Dr. Hayes answered immediately. That doesn't matter. Richard raised an eyebrow. It matters to me. The hospital can't function if every nurse decides which doctor's orders to follow. Karen remained silent. Deep inside, she knew something didn't feel right. Every report described Hannah as difficult. Every patient connected to those reports had gone home alive. Those two facts refused to fit together. Richard opened another folder. This is different. Karen looked up. What is it? Hannah sent a document directly to the hospital board. Karen's eyes widened. The board. Richard nodded. Without executive approval. He pushed the document across the table. It was nearly 15 pages long. Every page contained dates, patient cases, staffing numbers, medication delays, near-miss incidents, nurse overtime records. No emotional language. No personal attacks. Just facts. Hundreds of carefully documented facts. Karen slowly turned each page. She collected all of this herself? Richard nodded. Over several months. Dr. Hayes looked irritated. She's building a case against this hospital. Karen continued reading. The report described exhausted nurses working double shifts. Medication errors caught only seconds before reaching patients. Delayed physician responses. Short staffing during critical emergencies. Growing fear among nurses who wanted to report safety concerns. At the end, Hannah made 4 simple requests. An independent staffing review. Temporary suspension of mandatory overtime. Protection for employees reporting safety concerns. An outside investigation into altered incident reports. Karen looked up. These aren't unreasonable requests. Richard's expression became harder. She copied every member of the hospital board. The room became quiet again. Dr. Hayes finally spoke. She went around leadership. Yes. That's insubordination. Karen closed the report. Or whistleblowing. Richard immediately looked toward her. There is a difference. Karen answered softly. Sometimes. Richard stood and walked toward the window. We can't allow employees to bypass administration. Karen remained seated. What if administration ignores them? Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at the snowy parking lot below. This hospital has a reputation. A reputation built over decades. Investors. Donors. National rankings. We cannot let one nurse damage everything. Karen quietly asked, what if she's telling the truth? Dr. Hayes answered before Richard could. Truth isn't the issue. Karen looked directly at him. What is? Control. Silence filled the room. Nobody denied it. Richard finally returned to the table. He opened Hannah's personnel file again. The first warning. He flipped another page. The second warning. Another page. Multiple documented conflicts with senior physicians. Karen frowned. Those reports leave out important details. Richard looked at her. They include enough. No. They include what supports the conclusion. Dr. Hayes leaned forward. The conclusion has already been reached. Karen slowly looked from one executive to the other. Only then did she understand. This meeting wasn't about deciding Hannah's future. That decision had already been made. This meeting was about creating paperwork to justify it. Meanwhile, completely unaware of what was happening upstairs, Hannah continued working another night shift. She checked medication, revived chats, comforted worried families, helped a frightened elderly patient call his granddaughter before surgery. She smiled, listened, encouraged. No one looking at her would guess powerful executives were discussing how to end her career. Olivia found her standing outside another patient room. You've been quiet tonight. I've been thinking. About the meetings? Hannah nodded. They're collecting paperwork. Olivia looked nervous. You really think they'll fire you? I think they've already decided. Olivia's heart sank. What are you going to do? Hannah looked through the glass at an elderly woman sleeping peacefully. The same thing I've always done. And what's that? She smiled gently. Take care of the next patient. Olivia couldn't understand how someone facing unemployment could remain so calm. But Hannah knew something important. Fear could distract you. Patients couldn't wait while nurses worried about themselves. Lives kept moving. So did she. A few minutes later, an elderly man suddenly pressed the emergency button. His breathing had become difficult. Within seconds, Hannah rushed into the room. Everything else disappeared. Meetings, warnings, politics. None of it mattered anymore. Right now, only one life mattered. And upstairs, Richard Bennett quietly signed the first document authorizing the formal termination review of Hannah Brooks. The countdown had officially begun. The next morning arrived quietly. For everyone else, it was another ordinary workday. For Hannah Brooks, it was the day her entire life was about to change. She walked through the hospital entrance carrying her usual travel mug filled with coffee. She smiled at the receptionist, waved to the security guard, stopped to help an elderly visitor find the cardiology department. Nothing about her routine had changed. But upstairs, a meeting had already been scheduled. At exactly 3 o'clock. Mandatory attendance. No explanation. At 9:15 that morning, Hannah's phone vibrated. A short email appeared. Administrative meeting. Conference room 4. Attendance required. 3 p.m. She stared at the message for several seconds, then quietly locked her phone. Olivia noticed immediately. What happened? Administration wants to see me. Olivia's face lost its color. Today. Hannah nodded. I think this is it. Olivia grabbed her arm. You can't go in there alone. I've already contacted the nurses' union. What did they say? They told me to listen carefully and never sign anything without reading every word. Olivia forced a smile. I have a bad feeling. Hannah looked toward the ICU. So do I. But our patients don't get to choose easier days. She walked toward her next room as though nothing had happened. Every patient still deserved her full attention. Even if the hospital had already decided she didn't deserve to stay. The hours passed slowly. Hannah checked medications, changed dressings, explained treatment plans to worried families, comforted a frightened little boy waiting for his grandfather to wake up after surgery. No one looking at her would guess she might be unemployed before sunset. At exactly 2:58 p.m., she stood outside conference room 4. She took one deep breath, then opened the door. Inside sat CEO Richard Bennett, Human Resources Director Karen Foster, and a legal advisor she had never met before. An empty chair waited for her. Richard smiled politely. "Please, have a seat." Hannah sat down. The room felt strangely cold. Richard folded his hands. "Thank you for coming." She nodded. "You've been an employee of North Valley Medical Center for 13 years. "Yes. And you've made many valuable contributions." She remained silent. But there it was. That one word. But. Richard opened a thick folder. "We've completed a review of your employment history." Karen slowly pushed a document across the table. Hannah looked down. 4 pages. The title read, "Notice of Employment Termination." She didn't touch it immediately. Instead, she looked at Richard. "Is the decision already final?" Richard answered carefully, "This meeting is part of the official process." Hannah asked another question. "Was the decision made before I walked into this room?" No one answered. That silence told her everything. She slowly opened the document. Every warning she'd ever received was listed. Every disagreement. Every report. Every accusation. The document described her as difficult, uncooperative, disruptive, unable to follow leadership. Not one sentence mentioned the patients whose lives had been saved. She finished reading every page, then quietly closed the folder. Hannah looked directly at Richard. "I have one question." He nodded. "Go ahead. Name one patient who was harmed because I spoke up." The room became silent. Richard shifted slightly in his chair. "This meeting isn't about individual cases." She didn't look away. "Name one." Karen lowered her eyes. Richard cleared his throat. "The issue is your behavior." Hannah spoke calmly. "No. The issue is that every patient I questioned later needed emergency treatment." Richard answered with a colder voice. "This hospital cannot function if employees ignore the chain of command." Hannah nodded slowly. "The chain of command sent Margaret Collins home during a heart attack." Nobody replied. "The chain of command delayed treatment for Daniel Rivera while sepsis spread through his body." Still. Silence. She leaned back slightly. "You still haven't answered my question." Richard's expression hardened. "The decision is final." Hannah quietly closed the folder. "You've answered it." Richard looked confused. "I explained the hospital's position." "No. You explained the hospital's priorities." The meeting lasted less than 15 minutes. 13 years. Ended in 15 minutes. Hospital policy required an HR representative to accompany terminated employees while collecting personal belongings. Karen walked beside Hannah toward the staff lockers. Neither woman spoke. The hallway felt longer than ever before. Doctors walked past pretending not to notice. Nurses became unusually busy. Everyone knew. No one wanted to become involved. Karen finally broke the silence. "I'm sorry." Hannah continued walking. "For what?" Karen hesitated. "For how this happened. You prepared the paperwork." "I didn't make the decision. You made it possible." Karen stopped walking. "I had responsibilities too." Hannah looked at her gently. "So did I." They reached locker 27. Hannah opened the metal door. Inside, there wasn't much. A worn coffee mug. A framed photograph of her father. A folded military medical patch with its identification number removed years ago. Karen noticed it. "I've never asked." Hannah quietly placed it into a small cardboard box. "It isn't important." At that moment, Olivia hurried into the locker room. She froze when she saw the box. "No." Tears immediately filled her eyes. They actually did it. Hannah nodded once. Olivia looked toward Karen. You fired the best nurse in this hospital. Karen couldn't answer. Olivia turned back to Hannah. This isn't fair. Hannah gently placed a hand on her shoulder. There are still patients outside those doors. How can you think about patients right now? Because they didn't choose this. Olivia wiped away a tear. What am I supposed to do the next time I know something is wrong? Hannah looked directly into her eyes. Speak. They'll punish me. They might. Then why should I? Hannah answered softly. Hannah Brooks woke up without an alarm reminding her to get ready for another night shift. The small apartment felt strangely quiet. No hospital radio. No pagiv. No emergency calls. Only silence. She made herself a cup of coffee and sat beside the living room window. Snow had finally stopped falling. Children were walking to school. Parents hurried toward work. The world kept moving. Even though her own life suddenly felt frozen. She opened a notebook she had carried for years. Inside were hundreds of handwritten notes. Not patient names. Never anything confidential. Only lessons. Things she had learned. Mistakes she promised herself never to repeat. Little reminders like, listen before you speak. Fear hides inside confidence. Families notice changes before machines do. She smiled softly while reading them. No one could fire those lessons. No one could erase 13 years of doing the right thing. Her phone remained silent all morning. Not one message from hospital leadership. Not one apology. Only one short text from Olivia. The ICU doesn't feel the same without you. Hannah smiled sadly before replying. Take care of them. Back at North Valley Medical Center. Things were already beginning to fall apart. The night shift felt unusually tense. Several experienced nurses quietly discussed Hannah's dismissal. Nobody wanted to say too much. The walls suddenly felt like they were listening. Olivia noticed small mistakes appearing everywhere. A medication was delivered to the wrong room. A laboratory sample was delayed. A patient's allergy bracelet had been placed upside down. None of the errors caused harm. But Hannah usually noticed these tiny problems before anyone else did. Now, no one was catching them. Even doctors noticed the difference. Dr. Michael Turner reviewed the previous night's incident reports. He frowned. This isn't normal. Another physician looked over. What do you mean? We've had 4 preventable delays in one shift. The other doctor shrugged. Busy night. Michael slowly shook his head. No. We're missing someone. He already knew exactly who. Meanwhile, Olivia entered room 8 to check on an elderly woman recovering from lung surgery. The patient smiled weakly. Where's the quiet nurse? Olivia looked surprised. Which one? The one who always remembered my granddaughter's name. Hannah. Yes. I haven't seen her. Olivia forced a smile. She doesn't work here anymore. The elderly woman's face fell. That's impossible. Olivia wished it were. Later that afternoon, hospital CEO Richard Bennett received an unexpected phone call. The caller identified herself as Eleanor Price, chairwoman of the hospital board. Richard immediately straightened in his chair. Good afternoon. Her voice sounded calm. Too calm. I've finished reading the safety report. Richard remained silent. I also reviewed Hannah Brooks' termination documents. Another long silence followed. Then Eleanor asked one simple question. Why wasn't the board informed before she was dismissed? Richard carefully chose his words. It was an internal personnel matter. It became a board matter the moment she filed an official patient safety report. Richard felt his stomach tighten. We followed policy. Eleanor answered immediately. Did you? I believe so. You believe? Richard looked toward the closed office door. The situation is complicated. No. Her voice became firmer. It is either ethical. Or it isn't. Richard rubbed his forehead. What are you asking? I'm asking why every patient case she questioned later proved to involve a serious medical emergency. Richard had no answer. I'll expect every report on my desk by tomorrow morning. Before he could respond, the call ended. Richard slowly lowered the phone. For the first time since firing Hannah, he looked genuinely worried. That evening, Karen Foster entered Richard's office carrying another folder. You wanted to see me? Richard pointed toward the chair. Seat. Karen immediately noticed his expression. What happened? The board knows. Her eyes widened. They read Hannah's report? They've read everything. Karen quietly sat down. What do they want? A full investigation. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Karen finally asked, should we have listened to her? Richard looked exhausted. I don't know anymore. Karen slowly placed another document on his desk. What is this? Since Hannah left, medication delays have increased. Staff overtime has doubled. 3 senior nurses have submitted resignation letters. 2 more requested transfers this morning. Richard stared at the numbers. Already? Karen nodded. People are scared. They think if Hannah could be fired, anyone can. Richard looked toward the hospital outside his office window. For years, he believed leadership meant protecting the hospital's image. Now he was beginning to wonder. Had protecting the image actually damaged the hospital itself? At that exact moment, across town, Hannah was volunteering at a small neighborhood health clinic. She wasn't getting paid. She wasn't looking for publicity. She simply couldn't stop helping people. An elderly homeless man walked inside complaining of severe pain in his leg. The tiny clinic didn't have expensive equipment. No advanced scanners. No large medical team. Only careful observation. Hannah knelt beside him. Asked gentle questions. Checked his circulation. Examined his swollen foot. Within seconds, her expression changed. This isn't just an injury. The volunteer doctor looked over. What do you see? She answered quietly. I think the infection is spreading much faster than it appears. The man was rushed to a larger hospital immediately. Doctors later confirmed that he had a life-threatening infection that could have cost him his leg, or even his life, if treatment had been delayed. Once again, Hannah had saved someone. Without recognition. Without applause. Without even wearing the uniform of North Valley Medical Center. And miles away, hospital executives were just beginning to realize a painful truth. They hadn't removed the problem. They had removed the person who kept everyone else safe. The news spread through North Valley Medical Center faster than anyone expected. The board of directors had officially launched an independent investigation. Managers stopped speaking so confidently. Department heads suddenly became careful with every email they wrote. Doctors who had ignored Hannah's concerns weeks earlier now found themselves answering difficult questions. Nobody knew how far the investigation would go, but everyone understood one thing. Nothing inside the hospital would stay the same. Olivia noticed the change immediately. The same administrators who once ignored nurses were suddenly asking for opinions. Supervisors wanted written reports. Every medication delay had to be documented. Every staffing shortage needed an explanation. It was exactly what Hannah had been requesting for months. Only now, people were finally listening. Too late. Across town, Hannah continued volunteering at the neighborhood health clinic. She wore simple blue scrubs without any hospital logo. Patients never asked where she used to work. They only cared that she listened. An elderly woman arrived with her grandson. The little boy looked worried. My grandma keeps saying she's tired, he whispered. Hannah knelt beside him. You brought her here. He nodded. I was scared. You did the right thing. The grandmother smiled weakly. It's probably just my age. Hannah gently checked her pulse. Then she looked into the woman's eyes. Something didn't feel right. She ordered basic tests through the clinic physician. Within an hour, the woman was transferred to a larger hospital after doctors discovered severe internal bleeding. The young boy hugged Hannah before leaving. Thank you for believing me. She smiled. Sometimes children notice things adults forget. The volunteer doctor watched the ambulance disappear. You've done it again. Hannah simply replied, I only listened. Meanwhile, back at North Valley Medical Center, board chairwoman Eleanor Price arrived without announcing her visit. No cameras. No reporters. No warning. She quietly walked through the emergency department. She spoke with nurses, respiratory therapists, cleaning staff, receptionists. She asked the same question again and again. If you had one concern about patient safety, what would it be? At first, people were nervous. But once they realized she was genuinely listening, the answers began pouring out. We're always short-staffed. Experienced nurses keep leaving. People are afraid to question dangerous decisions. Hannah always spoke for us. One nurse lowered her voice. We should have stood beside her. Eleanor carefully wrote every answer into a notebook. Not once did she interrupt. Not once did she defend management. When she finished, she asked one final question. Tell me about Hannah Brooks. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then an older janitor smiled. I've worked here 21 years. I've seen hundreds of nurses. But only one remembered every patient's name. Another nurse added, she stayed after her shift ended if a family needed someone to explain what the doctors said. A respiratory therapist quietly said, she caught mistakes before the machines did. Even the hospital chaplain joined the conversation. I've comforted families after tragedies. Hannah always tried to prevent those tragedies before I ever met the families. Eleanor closed her notebook. She had heard enough. That evening, while reviewing archive personnel records, a member of the investigation team discovered something unusual. One file had been marked confidential years earlier. It wasn't connected to Hannah's disciplinary reports. It wasn't even stored with ordinary employee records. The investigator carefully carried the folder to Eleanor's office. You should see this. She opened the file. Inside, there was only one newspaper clipping, several military commendation letters, and one sealed recommendation, signed by a former Secretary of Health. The newspaper headline immediately caught her attention. Unknown emergency nurse saves young national leader during highway disaster. Eleanor looked confused. There are no names. The investigator nodded. They were intentionally removed. The article explained that nearly 18 years earlier, a government convoy carrying several public officials had been involved in a devastating highway accident during a severe snowstorm. Most emergency responders focused on the obvious injuries. But one young emergency nurse noticed that a teenage passenger, the son of a nationally respected senator, wasn't breathing normally. Everyone believed he was simply unconscious. The young nurse insisted his airway was collapsing internally, despite being ignored at first. She refused to step away. Her quick actions restored his breathing before permanent brain damage could occur. Years later, that same teenager entered public service. Today, he was one of the country's most respected political leaders. His identity remained confidential in the report. But one detail stood out. The emergency nurse's name. Hannah Brooks. Eleanor slowly looked up. So this is why the file was sealed. The investigator nodded. The government requested complete confidentiality. Eleanor leaned back in her chair. The hospital fired a woman whose judgment had already saved one of the nation's future leaders. And almost no one here even knew. At that exact moment, Richard Bennett received another phone call. It was Eleanor. His voice sounded nervous. Good evening. She didn't waste a second. Richard. Do you know who Hannah Brooks really is? He frowned. What do you mean? You'll find out tomorrow morning. Then she ended the call. Richard stared at the silent phone. For the first time since becoming CEO, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Real fear. Because deep inside, he realized the hospital hadn't simply made a mistake. It had fired someone whose courage had already changed history. The next morning, North Valley Medical Center had never felt so quiet. Doctors walked through the hallways speaking in low voices. Nurses glanced toward the executive offices every few minutes. Rumors were spreading faster than anyone could control them. The board of directors had arrived. Not one member. Not two. Nearly the entire executive oversight committee had entered the hospital before sunrise. No cameras followed them. No reporters stood outside. This wasn't a public event. It was something much more serious. Inside the executive conference room, CEO Richard Bennett sat nervously at the head of the table. Karen Foster was beside him. Dr. Victor Hayes avoided eye contact with everyone. The atmosphere felt completely different from the meeting where they had decided to fire Hannah. Back then, they believed they were protecting the hospital. Now, they weren't sure they could protect themselves. A few moments later, Board Chairwoman Eleanor Price entered carrying several thick folders. She placed them carefully on the table. Nobody spoke. She slowly looked around the room. I've spent the last 48 hours reviewing every report. Her voice remained calm. But today, we're not discussing Hannah Brooks. Richard looked confused. We're discussing leadership. Silence filled the room. Eleanor opened the first folder. This hospital dismissed an employee for repeatedly reporting patient safety concerns. She opened another. Every major concern she documented was later confirmed. Another folder. Several reports were minimized before reaching the board. Another. Important details were removed from internal summaries. Richard slowly lowered his eyes. Eleanor looked directly at him. Can you explain why? Richard took a deep breath. We believed we were following policy. She answered immediately. No. You were protecting appearances. Nobody argued. Because nobody could. Eleanor continued. I also reviewed confidential government correspondence. She held up the sealed recommendation letter. The nurse you dismissed was formally recognized years ago for extraordinary emergency judgment during a nationally significant incident. Richard swallowed hard. Karen looked toward the letter. Dr. Hayes remained completely silent. Eleanor carefully placed the letter back into the folder. Her identity remained confidential because of federal security requirements. She looked around the room. Yet even without knowing that history, you still had enough evidence to understand her value. She turned another page. Tell me, how many patients suffered because Hannah ignored warning signs? No answer. How many? The silence grew heavier. Finally, Richard spoke quietly. None. How many patients survived after Hannah raised concerns? Karen answered almost in a whisper. All of them. Eleanor nodded. So explain to me why the person protecting patients became the one person your administration considered the problem. No one could answer. Because there was no answer. Only excuses. And excuses no longer mattered. Meanwhile, miles away, Hannah had no idea what was happening. She was once again volunteering at the neighborhood clinic. A young pregnant woman arrived looking frightened. She complained of severe headaches, blurred vision, swollen hands. The clinic was crowded. Some patients had already been waiting for hours. The young woman apologized repeatedly. I don't want to bother anyone. Hannah smiled warmly. You never bother us. She gently checked her blood pressure. Her smile disappeared. The reading was dangerously high. She immediately called for the clinic physician. Within minutes, an ambulance was on its way. The doctor later confirmed that the young mother was developing a life-threatening pregnancy complication. Because treatment began immediately. Both mother and baby survived. After the ambulance left, the volunteer doctor looked at Hannah. I've worked with many nurses. I've never seen anyone recognize danger as quickly as you. Hannah simply shrugged. I pay attention. The doctor smiled. I think it's more than that. She quietly replied. Every patient gives us clues. We just have to notice them. Green Heart heroes don't always ask for recognition. If you believe quiet courage deserves to be celebrated, like, subscribe, and share this story. Back inside North Valley Medical Center, the investigation continued. Board members interviewed dozens of employees, one after another. Nurses described how Hannah stayed late without pay to comfort frightened families. Patients sent thank you letters praising her kindness. Former coworkers shared stories that had never appeared in official records. A maintenance worker remembered Hannah helping him perform CPR on a visitor who had collapsed in the lobby. A cafeteria employee recalled Hannah buying meals for families who couldn't afford food while waiting beside loved ones. A security officer quietly admitted, when everyone else panicked, she stayed calm. Piece by piece, a picture began to emerge, not of a difficult employee, but of an extraordinary human being. By late afternoon, Eleanor placed one final document in front of Richard Bennett. "What is this?" he asked. "A unanimous recommendation from the board." Richard slowly opened the paper. As he read each line, his face turned pale. The recommendation was clear. Immediately offer Hannah Brooks her position back with full seniority, complete back pay, a formal public apology, and authority to lead a new patient safety improvement program reporting directly to the board. Richard looked up in disbelief. "And if she refuses?" Eleanor answered softly. "Then we'll spend years explaining why we let our best nurse walk away." Richard stared at the document. For the first time, he realized something painful. Some mistakes could be corrected, but trust, once broken, was much harder to earn back. At that exact moment, Karen quietly picked up her phone. She looked at Hannah's contact information one last time. Then she whispered, "I hope she answers." Her finger slowly moved toward the call button. Karen's finger hovered over the call button. The room was completely silent. Every member of the board watched her. No one spoke. No one moved. Finally, she pressed the button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then, "Hannah speaking." Karen closed her eyes for a moment. "Hannah, it's Karen Foster." There was a brief silence. "Is everything all right?" Karen wasn't expecting that question. After everything the hospital had done, Hannah's first concern was whether someone needed help. Karen swallowed hard. "No. I mean, yes. Actually, I was hoping we could meet." "What about?" "The board has completed its investigation." Another short silence. "I understand." Karen continued carefully. "They would like to apologize." Hannah didn't answer immediately. Finally she asked, "Is this apology for me? Or for the patients?" Karen had no answer. "Would you be willing to come to the hospital this afternoon?" Hannah looked across the small community clinic where she was organizing medication for elderly patients. "When my shift here is finished." "Thank you." Karen quietly ended the call. She looked toward Eleanor. She said yes. For the first time all day. Someone in the room smiled. Blueheart, if you've been following Hannah's journey from the beginning, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us continue bringing stories that inspire millions. Late that afternoon, Hannah walked back through the entrance of North Valley Medical Center. The same doors, the same lobby, the same floors, but everything felt different. Employees stopped what they were doing. Some smiled. Others lowered their heads in embarrassment. The security guard who had greeted her every morning stepped forward. "I'm glad to see you again." She smiled warmly. "It's good to see you too." When the elevator doors opened on the executive floor, Richard Bennett was already waiting. So was Karen, Dr. Michael Turner, Olivia, and every member of the hospital board. Olivia couldn't hold back her emotions. She rushed forward and hugged Hannah tightly. "I missed you." Hannah hugged her back. "I missed you too." Several nurses quietly wiped away tears. Richard stepped forward. His voice sounded very different from the confident executive everyone knew. "Hannah, I owe you an apology." She remained silent. "I failed you. I failed this hospital. And most importantly, I failed our patients." The hallway became completely still. Richard continued. "I confused protecting our reputation with protecting the people inside this building. I was wrong. No cameras were recording. No reporters were watching. There was no audience. Only honesty." Eleanor Price stepped forward holding a folder. "The board has voted unanimously." She handed the document to Hannah. "We are offering you full reinstatement. All lost salary will be paid. Your employment record will be completely cleared. You will report directly to the board as Director of Patient Safety. No administrator will be allowed to block your safety reports again." The hallway remained silent. Everyone waited. Olivia smiled hopefully. Karen looked nervous. Richard lowered his eyes. Hannah slowly read every page. When she finished, she gently closed the folder. Then she looked around at every face. I appreciate the apology. Richard nodded. You deserve much more than that. She smiled kindly. But I can't come back. The words echoed through the hallway. Olivia's smile disappeared. Karen looked shocked. Richard stared at her. You refuse? Hannah nodded. Yes. Richard looked heartbroken. May I ask why? She answered softly. Because healing this hospital isn't my responsibility anymore. I tried. I warned everyone. I documented everything. I spoke when it was difficult. But no one listened until I was gone. No one argued. Because every word was true. She continued. During the past few weeks, I've worked at a small community clinic. They don't have expensive equipment. They don't have beautiful buildings. But every voice matters. When someone raises a concern, people listen. Richard quietly asked, Is that where you're staying? Hannah smiled. Yes, I've already accepted a permanent position. Olivia's eyes filled with tears. So this is goodbye? Hannah gently held her hands. No, it's a new beginning. She reached into her bag and handed Olivia a small notebook. The lessons I've collected over 13 years. Olivia opened it carefully. Every page contained handwritten reminders, simple observations, practical advice, words of encouragement. At the very end, one sentence had been written in larger letters. Never be afraid to speak for someone who cannot speak for themselves. Olivia hugged the notebook against her chest. I promise. Hannah smiled. I know you will. Before leaving, Hannah turned toward everyone gathered in the hallway. I don't want revenge. I don't want anyone fired. I only want one promise. Eleanor nodded. What is it? Hannah looked around the hospital one last time. The next nurse who speaks up. Listen. No one said a word. They simply nodded. Because they finally understood. Hannah walked toward the elevator. The door slowly closed. She never looked back. Months passed. North Valley Medical Center changed. The board introduced new patient safety policies. Anonymous reporting systems were created. Mandatory staffing reviews became routine. Every safety concern received immediate investigation. New nurses were taught that respectful questions could save lives. In every orientation session, a single sentence was displayed on the screen. One observation can save a life. No name appeared beneath it. But everyone knew where those words had come from. Meanwhile, at the small community clinic, patients lined up every morning before the doors opened. They came because they had heard about a nurse who never rushed. A nurse who remembered names. A nurse who listened before speaking. A nurse who believed every patient deserved dignity. One rainy afternoon, a black government vehicle quietly stopped outside the clinic. A man in a simple suit stepped out. He carried no cameras. No reporters followed him. He walked inside and smiled when he saw Hannah. I've wanted to thank you for many years. She recognized him immediately. He was the young survivor from that highway accident. Now one of the nation's most respected leaders. You probably don't remember me, he said. Hannah smiled warmly. I remember every patient. He laughed softly. You saved my life. You gave me the chance to grow up. You never asked for recognition. You never told anyone. She simply replied, I was doing my job. He shook his head. No. You were doing much more than that. Before leaving, he quietly donated enough money to expand the community clinic. No announcement was made. No press conference was held. No plaque carried his name. The only request he made was simple. Help more people. Years later, people still told stories about the quiet nurse who refused to stay silent. Some remembered the lives she saved. Others remembered the hospital that made the biggest mistake of its history. But those who truly knew Hannah remembered something even more important. Great heroes don't become great because they receive awards. They become great because they choose kindness. Even when kindness costs them everything. And somewhere tonight, perhaps in another hospital, Another nurse will notice one small detail that everyone else missed. Because of stories like Hannah's. Maybe that nurse will have the courage to speak. And maybe one more life will be saved.